Torna Fem Ciència, una sèrie fonamental per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Avui parlarem amb Marta Lourenço, investigadora i directora del Museu Nacional de Història Natural i Ciència de la Universidad de Lisboa. Els seus temes d'estudi es centren en la història de les col·leccions i el patrimoni universitari. Destacar la quantitat d'activitats que s'estan duent a terme al Museu Nacional d'Història Natural i de Ciència de Lisboa, tant de manera presencial com virtual. Les podeu consultar a la seva pàgina web i al seu canal de YouTube. És la història de la ciència i la tecnologia sexista?
I think that history of science in itself is not sexist, but I think because it tries to reconstruct the past of the sciences, and the past of the sciences, what you have represented is much more males than females, because females are underrepresented. It doesn't mean that they didn't work and they didn't exist and that they were not brilliant. It's just they're underrepresented. And so they don't appear in the archives. You have to dig more and you don't find them. And so in the end, what comes about as a result is a history of science that is predominant male. There is an angle, a bias, right from the science, then in history, then in construction of narratives, then in the exhibition development. So it perpetuates everything, and male. But I think the tide is changing. So I think that women, and not only women, men are paying attention, are being sensitive to the issue, and are trying to recover, practices that have been hidden. Not only women, in fact, also technicians, for example, and preparators and students. The role that they have had in the construction of the sciences have been largely underrepresented, and so, but there is a recent effort to correct that.
S'hauria de commemorar la ciència. Què n'opines del Dia Internacional de la Dona i la Nena a la Ciència?
Well, I work in a museum of a scientific museum, and so when I think of commemorations, first of all, I think we shouldn't commemorate. The fact that we are commemorating is kind of, an acceptance that it's like quotas and stuff. It's like accepting and diagnosing a situation that is incorrect. And so we try to correct it. We try to raise awareness, in particular in this day, for the fact of the underrepresentation. And so in a museum, usually we do something about it in terms of we invite women scientists for lectures. We give voice, public voice, to women scientists and to women historians of science, and all those relations. So we try in a more public dimension, not so much in academic, although also, but mostly in a public dimension. We try to give visibility and voice to girls and to women.
Creus que la perspectiva de gènere està fora del radar de la cultura material, especialment en els instruments científics?
I do think that they are, but for the same reasons that I explained. So both from the perspective of the generators, so the engineers, the physicists, and so on, the astronomers, and so on, and also from the perspective of the collectors, so in a museum, the curators, and so on, there's always this underrepresentation of women and the role of women. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think that we need to do more effort about the instrumentation, because I think the bias is even more acute. The male bias, lab technician, is more a male thing. And so the stereotype is probably there even more than in the history of science, or, in the traditional narratives of history of science. So now that I'm thinking about it, I think that we should even make a bigger effort to dig and to make visibility, to give visibility to women in scientific instruments, because the makers are male, most, and also the tinkerers, you know, the cannibalization in the process of constructing science are very much male. So we should be aware of that, and should kind of, probably we're not telling the whole story.
Quin paper tenen els instruments científics en els museus de ciència actualment? Ens ensenyen més sobre la història o sobre la pròpia disciplina?
There's two sides of it. I think that they tell us more about history, but so about the practices of science, about the teaching, and so objects really encapsulate the history of the practices of teaching, research, but also transmission and so on. But the way we present them, okay, so the story they tell is one thing. The way that we in museums present them is another thing. And the majority of times that scientific instruments, historical scientific instruments, are present in an exhibition is more to tell the story of the science, okay? The science. So like a generator, for example, it tells the story, not of that generator, but of the production of energy. See what I mean? And we also need to correct that, because we are not telling a real story about the object that is present there. It's true that it can tell the story of any generator, can tell a story about energy, okay, about the pure concept of energy. It's true, but that particular generator that is in my museum, for example, it was made in Cambridge, UK. It was bought by the Faculty of Sciences in 1912. It was used by so and so and so and so, and it was used for these purposes and for these theses and so on. So that's the story of that particular generator, and that's where the practices are. But we don't tell that story. We don't tell that story because sometimes we lack documentation. Okay, so in order to tell the story, we need really to cross the materiality of the object with documents. And sometimes they are difficult to find, or we don't collect them, we ignore them. And so in the end, we end up telling the story of the science.
Quan parlem de patrimoni, moltes persones pensen en art o arquitectura. Com explicaries en poques paraules que la ciència també és patrimoni? En què es diferencia una col·lecció d'objectes per un museu científic o un museu d'art?
And this is probably the question that has been in my mind more time, and for which I didn't find the answer since I started working in a museum. What is the difference between an art museum and the science museum? Because there are elements that are the same, like creativity. There's a human side to it. So there are contexts that influence both artists and scientists, every one of us who are doing a human endeavor, you know. There are political aspects and dimensions because, you know, artists may not have money at some point, and then they have, and scientists the same. The scientific policies of the institution vary. Sometimes they are not good, they're volatile. So there are common things. What I think is really different is the quest for answers, okay? I think that an artist does not necessarily have a quest for answers about nature, about the universe, about ourselves as humans, perhaps a little bit about ourselves as humans. But the scientist really interrogates through objects in their daily practice, and they're looking for answers. And those answers are not definite answers. See what I mean? And so from there, we can transpose to heritage. So what do we have as evidence? Of art, we have of creativity and all these contexts, and of the person, certainly, the human who made the sculpture or painting and so on. But in science, and the beauty, certainly the beauty. But and it's for the observer, it creates an emotion, an aesthetical emotion, and so on. And it actually confronts us. Sometimes we don't like it, and we have kind of a rejection, and so on. In science, when you transpose to what is the material evidence of this quest, you have to look at objects as evidence of these answers and questions, successive questions and answers that are being posed. And the objects, the instruments are, they have these layers of stories, of questions and answers and errors and mistakes, and come back and go forth. And, so there's a different story there. And that's also a story of human capacity, human ingenuity. And so it's worth passing on to the next generations, because that's the whole thing about heritage. Is it worth patrimonio, right? You pass on pater, you pass on to the next generations. And so this is, but I don't have any, closed answers. This is my intuition. This is what I've been thinking about for 20 years or so.
Com creus que s'ha de tractar amb objectes possiblement robats o colonials?
You cannot have stolen objects. But it has nothing to do with colonial things, okay? Because that's another problem, another addition to the layer, of complexity. The problem, okay, now we get to the complexity. Sometimes you don't know you have stolen objects. That's the first problem. The second problem is that there is a current that thinks, and there is some arguments to be made about colonial objects all being stolen. Okay, that's a different thing. It's because there was this relation of power, that this inequality of power, and the people who were oppressed were not in condition to say, no, you don't take anything. No, they weren't, because they were being colonized. So, because just from the fact of being colonized, there is a problem there. So the objects become problematic, but they are also culturally sensitive objects. For example, human remains, for example, objects that are very symbolic, objects of power from the First Nations and so on, that were taken to European museums, for example. In my own museums, we have objects that we have 2.5 million objects that come from Portuguese former colonies, and they're all problematic in the sense they're all colonial, but only 11, only 11 I consider extremely problematic, sensitive, and that probably should be returned. And that's what we're doing, working with the communities of origins and the museums in Angola and Mozambique to discuss that, okay? But you have to have documentation. You really need to study the provenance of the objects, who collected them. If it's a military, is one problem. If it's a missionary, is another problem. If it's a Jesuit, is another problem. If it's a researcher, is another problem. So who collected them? Under which conditions? Was there a state of war between the colonized and the colonizer? Was there wars of resistance? I mean, there's so many parameters before you can really, there's a lot of research to be done before you consider them extremely problematic. But problematic, they're all, but they're not stolen, in my view. But also from the part of the former colonized countries, I mean, they should just make claims, And so we need to struggle. We need to fight this injustice, social, gender injustice. And we, in our museums, we cannot, just perpetuate nonsense, which is not true. It's just not a matter of labels. It's a matter of the way you work. It has to change. You have to collect more on women, You have to go and do provenance research to find out which are your problematic colonial objects. You really have to think about communities, and you have to be open to the outside world, especially with the communities of origin in colonial case. We have to work with Angola. We have to work with the Mozambique. We have to work with the diaspora here in Lisbon, for example. We have to work with them. We cannot stay closed and we know everything. So it's a mentality change more than and then the labels, are part of it. See what I mean? And we claim to be institutions of respectability, right? Museums are among the institutions that are most respected by society. And of course, if they are respected by society, and they claim that they have the responsibility to educate. So you cannot find yourself in a situation where you're not educating, you're just miseducating, and you communicating false truths and misinformation and so on. So you have to be very careful. And if I find anything, I'll tell them.
Muito obrigado, Marta. Aquesta ha estat l'última entrevista del primer bloc de Fem Ciència, Cultura Material. No us perdeu la taula rodona que serà al setembre i sobretot animeu-vos a participar enviant les vostres preguntes i comentaris a femciencia2@gmail.com. Fins aviat!